Hi, my name's Gareth Locke, and I'm the owner of The Human Diver. And one of the real powerful things trying to create within the diving community is an understanding of psychological safety and just culture. And, understand what the difference is, and more importantly, for you as divers, as instructors, as agency staff, dive center managers, understanding why should I care about these things and really understanding the subtle difference between them. They are linked. And what I'm going to do over the next 15, 20 minutes is give you an understanding of what they are and how they are linked together and what we can do about improving both psychological safety and a just culture. So to start off with, we're going to look at something a little bit slightly different, but it's core to understanding why we need to develop both psychological safety and a just culture. And that is this concept that we talk about, the principles of organizational and human performance, or human and organizational performance. The first principle is that humans are fallible and even the best people make mistakes. It doesn't matter how experienced or knowledgeable you are, you will make a mistake at some point. And what we're trying to do is address those. So consider that error is normal. It's out there all the time. So trying to get it to zero is a great idea, but we're never going to get there. The next piece is that error likely situations are predictable, manageable, and preventable. That means that we can develop ideas and systems to reduce the likelihood of them. And I put a slide out the other day about the WITH model, which looks at the conditions, the precursors that lead to errors happening. And if we can address those, then we are more likely to reduce the error from occurring. Importantly here is, but because it's predictable, manageable, and preventable, blaming the individual is of limited value. It fixes nothing because we don't necessarily change the system in which that person is operating. The next bit we're talking about is individual behaviours influenced by organisational processes and values. And by what we mean here is that behaviour is a function of the person and the environment or the context in which they are operating. And we can create situations where driving money becomes really important, productivity becomes more important than quality, and we have this trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. So let's look at the context in which things are happening rather than the outcomes. The next bit, we're talking about the teamwork and the effect of leadership and peer pressure. So people achieve high levels of performance based largely on the encouragement and reinforcement received from leaders, peers, and subordinates. How we respond to both good stuff and bad stuff really matters. If we blame people for making mistakes, well, they're not going to tell us that those things are happening because, errors are normal. So if we're going to have a go at people for making those mistakes, then we are likely to lose the intelligence, the understanding of what work really looks like, what diving looks like, what instruction looks like. What we've got to do is foster the environment that says people will provide that information back up the chain. But that's only possible if it is safe, psychologically safe to do so. And then finally, why learn the lessons ourselves the first time when actually there are plenty of opportunities out there to learn lessons again? So what we're trying to do here then is saying, how do we collect that information so we can learn? And what we've got to do is create the environment that says it's okay to talk about the mistakes or the errors, the violations that we make. So these are the principles that underpin high-risk organizations like nuclear power, like aviation, like construction, aircraft operations, aircraft carrier operations. These concepts can equally be applied to the diving community. And so understanding them makes it easier to develop both a psychological safety and a just culture. And you also see over the next slides the interdependence and the overlap that happens. So let's start with understanding human errors and violations that are out there. We talk about the failures that are there, and in the traditional safety sense, we break them down into two blocks, and we're talking about errors and violations. Errors is seen as this honest thing that they just happen, whereas actually violations where people choose to break the rules, and therefore we treat violations in a slightly different way. But I'm hoping over this next slide, you'll see that actually there is a subtle difference, that errors and violations have got the same properties. They allow us to learn. So start off with errors. They're broken down into these sort of three buckets that are there. We slip. We make a slip where we don't intend to do something. And that might be we end up shearing off a valve, or we end up ticking off a check sheet that we didn't mean to do. And we didn't intend to do it. So if we don't intend to make that mistake, telling somebody not to do it again is not likely to change much unless we change the environment they're operating in. If I've forgotten to do something, by definition, I won't remember until there is something that triggers my frame of reference, my memory that says, hang on a minute, I forgot to do that. And that might be that, you forgot to analyze your gas, and it's not until you get to the point where you need it, you look down and go, oh, there isn't an analysis tape here. What do I do? Or it might be that if you're diving a twin set and you haven't checked the center manifold valve, and now you realize that you've gone somewhere and you've done a check, and now you open that center, you go to check the manifold and you open it, now what do you do? So forgetting about something means that, we're not going to pick it up until there is a trigger point for our mind to say, that needs to change. Now, from a mistake point of view, if I'm doing the wrong thing, but I think it's right, well, hang on a minute, why would that would be, how would I pick that up? And I've just noticed, here we go, here's a lapse. When I wrote this slide, I forgot to include the word doing the wrong thing. So I didn't notice that until I just picked it up here. So even though I'm giving a presentation on this sort of stuff where it should all be right, I've made a mistake and I didn't notice that. I thought I was doing, so I thought I was doing it right, but I did it wrong. So I'm not going to pick that up until there is something as a trigger point. So these are the sort of unintentional, the honest mistakes that people make. Then we move into the violations, which people think are the dishonest mistakes that happen. Now, I'm going to expand on a little bit more of these and just say, okay, if we believe that we're following the rules, but we're not, how would we pick that up? I'm going to continue to break them until something happens. If everybody is breaking the rules, then it's really difficult to be the person that conforms. Speeding on the motorway is a classic example. The speed limit's 70 miles an hour. Most people in the UK drive at 80 miles an hour or so, somewhere around there, unless there are speed cameras in place. And then we start to come back to the normal. You could say that, everybody should brief before a dive, but not everybody does. If the instructor is not role modeling, then what we're going to do is saying, well, hang on a minute, they're not doing it, so why should I? We end up creating normal situations. Situational violation is where I can't do my job if I follow the rules, where we have a conflict potentially between money and time and the people that we're going to train. So understanding the situation and the context as to why somebody broke the rule allows us to address those factors. And then the final one, which is where we often think violations sit, it's a bucket that everything gets thrown into, as recklessness. And the industry, the high-risk industries, have recognised that actually these make up a fraction of a percent of the outcomes or the reasons why people ended up having the accident. Often people trying to do the best they can with the resources they've got. So from an analysis point of view in terms of learning, we can discount that recklessness and then look at the rest of them as learning opportunities. Even when people break the rules, we can start to look at why do those rules get broken. So now that we've got an understanding of the sort of errors that happen and the violations that happen, now we can move into psychological safety and just culture, because they're critical to understanding how we apply and why we should apply both psychological safety and a just culture. So I'm going to start off with psychological safety. What is it? Professor Amy Edmondson's considered the world expert on this, and here's a couple of quotes from books that she's written. A shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And in this idea, what we're talking about is the fact that it is okay to speak up. It is okay to say something that may not go down particularly well with the team. And that might be because we're challenging a plan. It might be because the instructor isn't doing something right. And what we're saying here is that I'm willing to speak up because I recognize the risk of carrying on is too great, that I'm not willing to accept the future potential consequences. What I'm going to do is put my hand up. And that actually might be about suggesting a good idea, but ultimately it's about changing the status quo, how we're doing things around here. Now, trust and psychological safety often get mixed up. Trust is more about a one-to-one relationship. And that is a case that, as it says here, I give others the benefit of the doubt when I take a risk. So in this case here is the fact that if I'm going to disagree, it's in a one-to-one relationship, even though we might be part of a team, it's a one-to-one relationship. And it says, actually, I'm going to trust that person to believe in me, in what I'm going to say, both positive or negatively. I'm also going to trust them that they're going to give me some work that I can do, that they can give me some skills that I can do, and they're going to trust me that I'm going to apply my best effort. So, as I said, it's normally a one-to-one relationship, even though you might be as part of a team. Psychological safety is slightly different. And this is a one-to-many and a many-to-one relationship where actually the whole group is what we're looking at. Is it okay for me to take a risk? Will others give me the benefit of the doubt when I take a risk, when I put my hand up, when I thumb a dive, when I actually even call the dive before we get in the water? That actually I'm diving with a new group and I can ask the question that says, why do you do it that way? What have I missed? How does it make sense for you to do that? Be curious, not confrontational. And so in this case here, it's about what the others will think about what I'm saying, both positive and negatively. So trust is one-to-one predominantly. Psychological safety is one-to-many and many-to-one. So what is psychological safety? Well, there's a great book here from Timothy Clark called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, and in which he talks about the early parts. And these are building blocks. If we don't have the basis below, i.e. inclusion safety, then we can't get to the top level, which is challenger safety. So inclusion safety is about bringing people into a team. Can I come and dive with you? No. Oh, okay. Or even worse is just ignore them. And with this inclusion, we have so many tribes in diving, where we have diver training agencies, we have clubs, we have users of certain equipment, and we like to be socially conformed. We like to have our little groups. And when we're outside of a group, then actually we don't feel at all part of that. So we don't feel included. Now, once we're included, what we can do is we can start to move up the ladder. And that allows us to learn. Now, learning means that we have the opportunity to fail. We make mistakes. And in this case here, what we're talking about is allowing people the ability to fail safely. We create a learning environment that they can make mistakes, that it doesn't matter from that perspective. Now, that means that we manage the risk. We don't want people to be pushing too hard. And if somebody does fail, we don't want to be in a catastrophic situation. So always create the environment that allows us to fail safely. The next bit is contributor safety. And this is a big step. We're now part of the team. And in this case here, I feel that I can contribute good ideas. I can suggest new ways of doing things based on my previous experience. And the team expect me to contribute. We brought you in, you're a new guy, you've got some complementary skills. Tell us what you've got and help us as a team develop. And then the final level is challenger safety, in which I believe is the most important part in diving, is that ability to challenge others when we consider things as being unsafe. We need to thumb the dive. We don't want to get off the boat because the conditions, yes, we can get off, but can we get back on again? So we move through this incremental process. And as the team, as the leader, you can revoke that safety quite quickly by being rude, by putting people down, by being demeaning. All of that means that we move back down and we may not ever get it back. It takes time to develop it, and you can destroy it really quickly. So how do we go about that? Developing psychological safety, create inclusion, include people, invite people into that. And if you practice it, it encourages in others, especially if you are an influential person. Allow others to fail and fail safely in the process. Create the environment where it is okay to make mistakes. On a learning dive, as a training dive, it's okay to make mistakes. That's what it's about. What we don't want to be doing is creating failure environments in high-risk situations. Allow others to contribute as part of your team. Bring in good ideas. They may have done something differently on a similar dive or a similar training course. Listen to them, bring that up. You are now operating as part of a team. As you're in the challenger place, expect the challenges to happen. Lead with the curious questions. Ask them how it made sense. What am I missing? Those are two really critical questions. And if you're leading, make sure that you provide cover for the team that you're operating with. Stand up, be a leader, and protect those people below, because actually then you will get the information coming up. And the sort of the statements at the bottom: be curious and not judgmental, definitely, and be proactive and not reactive. And the point here is that psychological safety is created prior to the point where somebody needs to put their hand up. And whereas we'll talk about just culture in a minute, it is a slightly different concept. So psychological safety is that ability to speak up and challenge if need be. That's the highest level. Now we're going to move on to just culture. And you'll see the overlap here. So psychological safety is proactive, that says it is okay to challenge. What we're talking about here as a just culture is looking back. We're creating an environment that looks back at errors and violations that have been made. And what we're talking about here is we don't punish people for the actions, omissions, and decisions taken by them, which are commensurate with their experience and their training. And I would also say understanding the drivers in which they are operating. What's the context? What's their commercial situation? What's their pressures at home? But at the same time, gross negligence, willful violations, and destructive acts are not tolerated. And the difficulty is something like gross negligence is only determined in a court of law, because they will weigh up the evidence that's there. Now, aviation is considered the sort of the role model for this. And one of the reasons it works really well is because they've got legal protection that allows information to be submitted as part of a safety investigation, and it cannot be used as part of a legal proceedings. Because what we want to do is create an environment where people talk about the whole story behind what's going on. Now, a just culture is part of a wider piece of a safety culture. When this comes from James Reason's safety culture model from the 1990s. With a just culture, it allows us to develop reporting. It allows us to create a learning culture that says, actually, there is information out there. How do I get better? An informed culture is saying that we know what's happening in the real world. It's not just compliance and following the rules that are there. There are real things that are out there that change. And we've got to find out what's happening at the sharp end if we want to change the organization. And on the top right is this flexible culture that says, you know what, we can change and we will change if we need to. Now, just culture, I've done a number of webinars on that. And if you want to get the links for that, let us know, and I will put something together. Now, one of the critical things here that comes from a quote from Nancy Leveson, professor in systems engineering, is this concept that blame is the enemy of safety. If we are going to blame people, what happens is we shut down conversations, we have limited investigations, because people won't be able to tell the truth. And as a consequence, people don't report those incidents. Now, investigations, there are two prime goals. Start off with, unfortunately in modern society, let's find somebody to pin the blame on. It's their fault. Now, anybody who's been involved in proper incident investigation, these are multifactorial. There are multiple contributory and causal factors that lead to an accident occurring. The problem is, in a legal situation, we're looking at to pin it on one person, one organization, one manufacturer, because it was their fault. And in reality, it is not like that. And that is what, as a documentary put together for a fatality from 2 years ago in Hawaii, when actually we look at the multiple factors that lead to this and how it made sense for the diver to get in the water as they did. So, finding someone to blame, that's great. We can pin it, we can sue it, we can get some money, but that doesn't necessarily help us prevent those things from occurring in the future, because a lot of investigations are closed. We don't see the context-rich information, and as a consequence, we don't get to learn. So that's the other reason for running an investigation. Learn how the event occurred and what we can do to prevent the conditions that led to the event. Now, those two are almost mutually exclusive, especially in the diving world. Because if we want to have a context-rich story that talks about all of the pressures that are there, the rules that got broken, why they are, well, now we just open ourselves up for litigation. So we don't get that story. So my sort of suggestion here is that we can start to develop a just culture, which is reactive because we're looking back at stuff that has happened. We can start looking at minor events. We can start to look at non-serious injuries, and we can start to look at that context, because there is very little difference between a minor injury and a fatality if we have one little step that changes. So let's look at the reasons behind this rather than actually focusing on the severity of the outcome. The fatalities and the serious injuries get the interest because they're emotionally significant, but you can find those same failures in non-serious injuries as well. So how do we develop a just culture? Recognise, to start with, we're all fallible, which is why the bit about human error and violations was done right at the start. If we don't understand how errors and violations occur, then it is really difficult to develop a just culture, because we go down to blame the last person who touched it. It was their fault. They should have seen this. I would have done something differently. Hang on a minute, let's change our attitudes. Don't seek out who's to blame. Look at how it made sense. People will create something called local rationality, how it made sense to do what they did. And even when we look back in this just culture, we may not necessarily understand everything that was going on. And this is one of the reasons why I think fatalities are not a particularly great way of learning, because the decision maker is normally dead. You can't ask them how it made sense for them to do what they did. Punishment isn't just in terms of litigation or disciplinary action. It's also social media, the shaming and blaming that goes on out there. Where people make mistakes, it's certainly getting better. But there are still places where people go, that was obvious that was going to happen. They must have been really stupid. They're a Darwin Award winner. And what we've got to look at is, how did it make sense? Let's unpick the story behind that. And, if you're in a leadership or a peer influencing position, your behaviors matter. You can start creating those changes by asking those curious questions yourself. By staying quiet, you're not contributing to the learning, the contribution that's there. But don't be judgmental, or don't be judgmental in a wrong way. Every comment we make is a judgment, but it is how we frame that is really important. And then finally, there are a number of incident reporting systems that are out there, but that's not enough. What we've got to do is create a learning culture that says, actually, I can learn from other people because they've made the mistakes. So let's take their failures as a learning opportunity for me. But that only works if we look back in time, as opposed to, I wouldn't do that. Okay, let's look at how it made sense. And have I encountered those conditions before? So as a summary, for the both bits of psychological safety and a just culture, psychological safety is proactive in action. And by that, I mean it is created before it is needed. And we can then reinforce it by the responses we have, but it can also be destroyed in reaction as well. A just culture is applied reactively because it looks at errors and violations which can only really be classified after the event. An error is an unintended action that led to an unintended consequence. Well, hang on a minute, that isn't what I can only determine that after the event. If I didn't think I was going to do it, I wouldn't do it. And then, crucially, this is how you can start to change attitudes. Be curious, not negatively judgmental. Fundamentally, ask that question, how did it make sense? Because it must have made sense. Even if you think, oh my God, that was going to be so obvious. They were going to end up bent. They were going to end up with a toxicity event. They were going to get separated. They're going to get lost. They're going to get entrapped. All of those events, if that person genuinely thought that's what the outcome was going to be, they wouldn't do it. So it's about changing attitudes. Psychological safety and just culture are different. They overlap because what we're trying to do is improve safety by the ability to speak up. One of those is prior to an event, and the other one is after the event, so we can learn from those matters. If you'd like to know more about what I do and the Human Diver does and the instructors that I've trained, visit thehumandiver.com. And if you want to learn more about the materials that I suggest in terms of psychological safety in a just culture, you can look here. Thanks so much for your time.